200 years ago, Britain gave railways to the world.
Nobody had seen anything going that fast.
They were like the rockets of their day, and the drivers were kind of like the astronauts.
Railways unleashed a new era.
The noise, the smell, the heat. It's not just a machine.
Transforming lives and landscapes.
Railway builders in Africa faced a whole new set of dangers.
The empire and the world became connected, bringing both unity and division.
Bullets are flying, shells are bursting, and yet they manage to clear the line.
Hundreds of black and white photographs and reels of film survive from those game-changing years. Now using the latest technology to transform rarely seen images and restore, sharpen and repair priceless damaged film, the railways come to life.
Oh wow, that's gorgeous. Everything is so gleaming.
This is the often surprising story of how a combination of ambitious engineering,
I hope I don't slip,
trailblazers and risk-takers changed Britain and the world.
The railways were just the most efficient form of transport. It's just something that's found its way everywhere. I feel proud that it's come from Britain.
By the end of the 19th century, railways had reshaped British society, culture, and the very pace of life. Travel on the country's vast and intricate rail network was part of the daily routine.
Everyone was touched in some way by the whole railway revolution, and almost everyone travelled by train. All ages, all classes, from the humble clerk to the factory owner.
Britain boasted over 60 locomotive manufacturers. Most of their sales were overseas. Passengers across the empire travelled in trains made in cities like Glasgow, Leeds and Manchester. These engines could cope with almost any terrain and weather.
Locomotive technology is very flexible. Once you get that fire going, it enables you to travel in all temperatures and all circumstances.
But there were still some parts of the world that had yet to greet the railway age. Large tracts of Australia, because of its vast size, hadn't seen the benefits of rail. Since the 1840s, Australians relied on an older form of transport to carry goods over long distances.
Before the railways were built, over 20,000 camels were imported from India and the Middle East, along with 2,000 handlers, to carry heavy goods across the harsh Australian landscape.
There had been calls for a rail line to link east and west since the 1880s. As the country unified politically, these calls became more urgent.
When Australia became a federation in 1901, one of the promises made to Western Australia in order to make it join the Union was the construction of a railway linking it with the states in the east. Now, it would be a treacherous route across miles and miles of arid desert.
Finally, in 1912, work began on a route to link Port Augusta with Kalgoorlie. The locos would be mostly British-built, but the construction was an Aussie enterprise. It would become known as the Trans-Australian Railway.
There is surviving footage of the building of this railway, and it shows this real mixture of old and new technologies. Because on one hand, you've got men using camels to plough the ground where the new line is going to go, and then along comes this really modern track-laying machine that can lay over 2 miles every day. The engineer in charge said it was often so hot it was impossible to even write, as the ink dried in his pen.
It took 5 years, 2.5 million wooden sleepers, and 140,000 tons of rails.
The last railway spike was hammered into place on the 17th of October 1917. The spectacular Trans-Australian Railway was complete. It boosted the nation's economy, improved communication, and unified the continent. Although the railways brought prosperity, rail travel could be hazardous, as the British knew all too well. In February 1901, young apprentices at the Eastleigh Railway Works in Hampshire were asked to build an unusual model.
This is just a slice, one compartment out of the centre of a carriage of compartments. It's sort of Barbie and Ken or Action Man, depending on your sort of personal background. The seats are upholstered with real moquette, which is the material used. There's luggage racks that are strung with tiny bits of string. The windows move up and down. There's even a smoking sign painted on the window.
Apprentices often made models to showcase their skills, but this one was different, and it reveals just how much the train had changed society. In January 1901, a woman named Rhoda King was travelling on a train from Southampton to London. Suddenly, a passenger named George Parker shot the man sitting opposite her, killing him instantly. Rhoda said, "My God, why did you do it?" Parker said bluntly, "He did it for money."
She manages to talk him down all the way into London, where they pull into the station. Parker flings open the door and tries to escape. Then he's sort of chased through the station into a nearby gasworks and arrested.
The model was built to help the prosecution's case at trial.
The lawyers wanted the jury to be able to picture the scene of the crime. I mean, the case against Parker was pretty watertight, but they didn't want to leave anything to chance.
The jury found George Parker guilty, and soon after he was executed. The public was gripped by the trial. Rhoda King's ordeal tapped into a fascination and dread of one of the few places Victorians were forced to get up close and personal: the railway compartment.
The big problem with compartments like this one is that there were no connecting corridors, so you were trapped with whoever you boarded the train with. If you got lucky, it might be a nice person to have a chat with. If you were unlucky, you could fall victim to crime. You were stuck together until you reached the next station.
It plays into anxieties, not just about murderers, but about those sort of intimacies of sharing space with strangers.
This new social setting provided perfect material for Victorian artists, who loved to tell a compelling story. This painting by Bertold Walzer is called The Irritating Gentleman.
We see a very vulnerable young woman dressed in black. She probably is in some kind of mourning. But he's oblivious to that, looming over her from behind, clearly trying to strike up a conversation. And it perfectly captures that moment that maybe many of us have had on public transport, where there is somebody who just insists on interacting with us. But for a vulnerable woman like that in the 19th century, this could be a very real threat, and that's what this painting's capturing.
Some artists depicted railway compartments as a place not of threat, but of romance. This is Abraham Solomon's 1854 painting, First Class, The Meeting and At First Meeting Loved.
We are seeing a group of three figures. A father who's slumped in the corner, fast asleep. His daughter, presumably, in the middle there. And she's deep in conversation with a young man who's clearly paying her a lot of attention. I think a painting painting like this looks quite old-fashioned to us today, but it would have been deeply shocking to people in the Victorian period because the daughter there is essentially unchaperoned. Her father is fast asleep in the corner, out for the count. He has no idea of the conversation that she's taking part in.
Solomon faced quite a bit of criticism for this painting, and so he painted a new version where all of those problems are ironed out. This time, the father is awake and he's sat between the two young lovers, policing their conversation in the proper Victorian way.
But by the end of the 19th century, Victorians were less easily shocked. Pioneering British filmmakers saw the railway compartment as a place for brief, illicit encounters. No chaperone was required. The very first of these was the popular comedy short from 1899, The Kiss in the Tunnel.
The film opens with a shot of a train driving into a tunnel. And clips like this were incredibly popular with early cinema audiences. It was exciting enough just to imagine yourself on a moving train while sitting in a cinema. But then this film does something new. It cuts to a shot of an interior of a carriage. A man and a woman are sitting opposite each other, and it's not clear whether they know each other. Are they husband and wife? Could they be strangers? Pretty soon, they get to know each other very well. They start kissing, not once, but twice. Soon, though, the train is about to leave the tunnel, and they resume what they were doing before, reading a newspaper and kind of pretending to not even know each other. And then we cut to the final shot as the train exits into the daylight.
Although seeing the story on the big screen would have caused a buzz, the plot itself was as old as the earliest passenger trains.
I've read stories in Victorian newspapers talking about the strange things that might go on in a tunnel. Stories of people playing practical jokes on each other or trying to frighten other passengers. People planting a kiss on the lips of a stranger that they've been glancing at across the carriage. And there are even some apocryphal stories of Victorian women feeling that they would need to put pins or needles in their lips to potentially guard themselves against these kisses.
By the time The Kiss in the Tunnel hit British cinemas, railways had been an agent of change for 3/4 of a century. But a new era was dawning. The world was about to shape the railways. Control of the tracks could win a war. In the 1860s, the British began a rapid expansion of their global railway empire. A priority was South Africa. It had been first colonized by the Dutch, then the British arrived in the early 19th century. Later, they built a railway network whose primary purpose was to carry goods, especially valuable minerals.
It's all driven by imperial expansion, by resource exploitation, and general strategic need at a time when Britain is also up against other rivals for African interests.
The South was made up of 2 British colonies, Natal and the Cape Colony, and the Boer republics of Transvaal and the Orange Free State. The Boers, descendants of the Dutch settlers, resented the British expansion.
They were pioneer farmers, they were courageous warriors, in addition to which they were extremely religious, they were extremely racist. But above all, what they wanted was to be left alone to follow their own belief system.
Tensions between the Boers and the British exploded into war in October 1899.
The railways in southern Africa were basic single-track lines used for the transportation of goods and passengers. But at the outbreak of the war, they suddenly became very important as a tool for the British Army.
The British realised they could use the railway network as an efficient way to deploy troops against the Boers, whose main tactic was lightning raids on horseback.
This is footage from 1899 of the Seaforth Highlanders Regiment being carried in coal wagons across a bridge. This bridge had been blown up by the Boers and had only recently been rebuilt. You can see a soldier in the front carriage saluting the cameraman.
A month after the outbreak of war, the Boers laid siege to several towns, including the railway hub of Ladysmith. Soon after, to the south in the town of Estcourt, a young journalist arrived and pitched his tent by the station. His name was Winston Churchill. What happened next would launch the future Prime Minister onto the world stage.
He was only 24, but he had already had an adventurous life as a cavalry officer. But politics was his true love, and he believed his best route to becoming a member of Parliament was to achieve fame.
For months, the British had been developing a way to squeeze even more of an advantage from the railway network: an armoured train. They'd been used with limited success in the American Civil War, but against the Boers, they'd be properly tested for the first time.
These armoured trains were not sophisticated machines. They had troop wagons reinforced with just thick boilerplate to protect the soldiers, and then they got these slits for their rifles. And then there was this carriage carrying a large gun, and that was actually taken usually from a warship and then manned by sailors.
Armoured trains were used for reconnaissance and to protect rail lines carrying military traffic. One stood in the sidings close to Churchill's tent. He thought hitching a ride could help get him close to the action.
Armoured trains have been going out daily from Estcourt, specifically to see if the Boers were planning some kind of expansion of their operations at Ladysmith, maybe even an attack on Estcourt itself. So he managed to blag himself a ride on the 15th of November.
At first light, the armoured train carrying 120 men, a 7-pound naval gun, and one journalist headed north, straight into an ambush.
Armoured trains look very intimidating, but they're very vulnerable to attack.
The engine driver reversed to get them out of trouble, just as the Boers expected. They'd placed boulders on the line. The train hit them at speed and was derailed.
Churchill takes control. This is a diminutive, freckly young kid in a way, barking orders left, right and centre. Bullets are flying, shells are bursting, and yet over 45 minutes, almost an hour of heavy work, they manage to clear the line.
The train, which was carrying the wounded, steamed away. The troops left behind scattered. Churchill found himself alone and tried to escape. In the chaos, he came face to face with 2 armed Boers.
Churchill reaches for his army-issue revolver, but he realises that he's left it on the train. But actually, this probably saves his life, because the Boers would surely have shot dead the man who had just led the defence of the train.
Churchill is taken prisoner, but later escapes. He makes sure his exploits become headline news.
He will return to Britain a hero of the empire. Now, with his name made, he is elected Conservative MP for Oldham, and that same Churchill will go on 40 years later to become Britain's wartime Prime Minister. It's worth reflecting that if it wasn't for South Africa, the Boer War, the armoured train incident, his career trajectory could have been very, very different.
The Boer War ended in May 1902. The British learned that the railways were a quick and effective way to transport troops around the empire. The railway companies of the Royal Engineers became a vital part of the British war machine. When the First World War broke out 12 years later, the lessons learned in the Boer War were put into practice on a massive scale.
The British government stopped all non-essential traffic, things like excursion trains to holiday destinations. And instead, trains took tens of thousands of soldiers to ports on the south coast. At one point, a troop train was arriving at Southampton every 12 minutes.
But across the Channel, the French network was unable to cope with the volume of wartime traffic, and damaged locomotives weren't being replaced. So hundreds of new, powerful engines were sent to shift supplies and munitions close to the front, like this 4300 class locomotive. Supplies were then taken by innovative narrow-gauge light railways to the trenches.
They were nicknamed portable railways. Several miles could be built in a single day. And in order to stop the Germans hearing them, the French experimented with wooden rails, and they even used metal from biscuit tins to protect vulnerable points on the line.
The railways in the First World War were highly efficient, but their success came at a price. They helped prolong the bloody trench warfare.
They created a stalemate. There was a constant flow of people and equipment to those trenches, and troops could be relieved and replenished and so on. It was very difficult for troops to move further forward because they no longer had the railways behind them. So essentially, it was the railways which caused the stalemate in the First World War, which lasted effectively for 3.5 years.
This is a photograph of some soldiers peering out of a shell-wrecked freight car near Beaucourt in France, taken towards the end of the war. And there's a real poignancy to this image. Because, of course, it was trains like this that caused the stalemate by continually resupplying the lines, prolonging the war, and leading to so much more loss of life.
War had brought about innovative train design, and the railway network had been forced to switch from civilian to military mode. War also changed who worked on the railways, which for some took a bit of getting used to. Before the First World War, Britain's railways employed women chiefly in catering, clerical or cleaning roles. But within months of war breaking out, all that changed.
World War I was an immense opportunity for women to show what they could do. They left the kitchen sink, they left being stuck in the home, and they came out and they did things they would never have done before if it hadn't been the war. And they met people they would never have met.
With so many men at the front, there were jobs to be filled. Around 35,000 women were employed as booking clerks, porters, and ticket collectors. This photograph, taken in 1917, shows cleaners from the Lancashire and Yorkshire Railway.
This is a beautiful moment where you see them coming together to do this type of work at a time where the nation needed everybody to be on board. To show this is the type of technology that they worked with and they were entrusted to work with is really powerful.
But for some of the railwaymen, the new arrivals were far from welcome.
There's this invasion into the office of young women. And with skills that perhaps you didn't have, like dictation and shorthand and things like that. And you'd spent your life working your way up, and here they were suddenly doing jobs that you could do. The men sitting in the offices must have found that really hard.
The railway bosses felt the need to reassure their male employees that women weren't a threat.
All the railway companies had their own in-house magazines. And in these magazines, they would show photographs of young female clerks. Sat in uniform, white blouse, sometimes they had a little tie, all very ladylike. They wanted to show them that these girls were still marriageable, young females that would soon be back home once the men got back.
The women's revolution was indeed short-lived. Within weeks of the end of the war, a third had given up their jobs to make way for returning soldiers. By 1920, only a few hundred remained. But soon a new role for young women was created, with international significance, to help the railways adapt to a fresh challenge. At the National Railway Museum in York is a unique collection of memorabilia.
What we see here, it's not real diamonds. It's costume jewellery, it's paste, it's gum. But even though they didn't have lots of monetary value, they would have been worth their weight in gold.
These tiaras were worn by girls who became teenage celebrities, known as railway queens, selected to represent and promote the railway industry.
You had to be a young woman between 15 and 17. You had to have a male relative who was a railway worker, and importantly, a paid-up member of one of the railway trade unions. Some of the young female entrants fall foul of this when it turns out uncles or brothers or things have not been quite up to date with their union membership fees.
It's not looking for someone of great beauty, but rather someone who could embody what the railway queen was to be. And it is looking for something like innocence and purity, rather than something glamorous.
The idea of railway queens was born in 1925, at a time when the industry was struggling.
They'd just come out of the First World War and were rebuilding after that. There was competition from the roads and automobile industry, and there was continuing strife from the railway unions.
Rail bosses organised a celebration of 100 years of rail to show how far the industry had come and how important it still was. But the unions felt excluded from the official events, so organised a separate festival.
They designed their own celebrations in Manchester on the 27th of September, 1925. During this event, they all came together, including the very first railway queen.
Thousands and thousands of people coming from across the country to attend this event. We're seeing a community coming together to be celebrated.
The first railway queen was Ella Wootton, the daughter of a GWR employee. She travelled the country, christening locomotives and promoting good causes. And she was so successful, crowning a queen became an annual event. After a year on the job, each queen went back to normal life.
She has to look regal. You have to believe that she isn't just the relative of a railway worker, she's stepped into a new role. And one of the most beautiful elements of this costume is the robe the Queen is dressed in. It is a sumptuous royal blue with gold brocade and tassels. She isn't just part of this railway community anymore, she is in a way a representative of the British Railways as a whole.
Every railway queen went on a foreign visit to promote goodwill between trade unions across the world. In 1936, it was the turn of 15-year-old Audrey Mawson. The Blackpool Railway Guard's daughter was thrust onto the international stage when she visited the Soviet Union, then under the firm grip of dictator Joseph Stalin.
It's in time of incredible tension in Europe, anxieties about a potential Second World War. And Audrey's visit is an opportunity for the Soviets and for Stalin as well to show they are a modern, peaceful country, even if that might not be what's happening behind the scenes.
In later life, Audrey wrote a memoir about her year as a railway queen.
It's a remarkable document. 1 minute Audrey is turning on the Blackpool illuminations, the next she's shaking hands with Joseph Stalin. And her memoir has some really lovely details. She writes, "Outside my suite during my stay there was always 2 bodyguards who were always with me wherever I went, and the car at my disposal was bulletproof. I thought this was all great fun. I didn't know anything of world affairs."
The highlight of Audrey's month-long visit was receiving a link of peace for the Railway Queen's chain of office.
We've seen the ceremonial tiaras, how they were crowned. We've seen that they didn't really cost much. This has an incredibly different kind of worth. Each link represents an international goodwill visit. The links actually represent the couplings between railway carriages. So we're always coming back to the railways and the significance of the railways.
The railway queens of the 20s and 30s were part of a new golden age of rail, with faster, sleeker trains. But soon, the railways would be faced with their greatest challenge yet. By the 1920s, Britain was still the locomotive builder to the empire and the world. But at home, the network was looking tired. The railway companies hadn't invested much in years.
It was clear that the old system of multiple private companies had run its course. They were told by the government, just sort it out, come together. And they did.
The result was the so-called Big Four: LMS, LNER, Southern, and the only one to retain its name, Great Western. The worn-out network was refreshed. Locomotives were given new liveries, and stations repainted. Gleaming new airplanes and automobiles had captured the public's imagination. Trains seemed grimy and old-fashioned, so the Big Four went on a PR offensive.
Posters were really important for creating brand identity. They could use logos, particular fonts, and these posters could be displayed in the waiting rooms and on the platforms. LNER went in for Art Deco in a big way in their posters, so really kind of getting across the glamour of the age, but also the kind of sense of speed and excitement and modernity. GWR, in contrast, their posters have a more kind of timeless elegance. They're more traditional in style, not quite so abstract. There was a real kind of understanding that there was now a need for bold design, imaginative use of colour, using really strong artists, the best artists of the day.
Soon, new, more glamorous trains came into service, like LNER's Flying Scotsman, designed by Britain's most famous railway engineer, Sir Nigel Gresley.
The Flying Scotsman cost just under £8,000 to build in 1923. That's about £2 million in today's terms. But it was worth the money. It became the undisputed star of the LNER's fleet, and people would gather just to see it fly past between Edinburgh and London in a cloud of steam.
Gresley was always looking to improve his locos. Influenced by sleek Bugatti racing cars, his next design looked like the future, the A4 Pacific class. The most famous was Mallard. Built in 1938, it's now in the National Railway Museum in York.
Well, the Mallard is a beautifully streamlined racehorse. It's a line that marries itself with the top of the chimney and sort of glides back down to the cab.
Matthew Delaney's great-grandfather, Joe Duddington, drove Mallard in its heyday.
It's always an emotional moment for me to come and see her. Every time that I come down, it's like visiting a relative.
Just 4 months after being built, LNER decided Mallard should attempt a new world speed record and seize the crown from the Germans, who'd reached 124.5 miles per hour. Nigel Gresley chose Joe Duddington to be at the controls.
He was known as a driver that would push her a little bit more, possibly knew less fear.
On the 3rd of July 1938, Joe was in the cab with fireman Tommy Bray. They headed south from Grantham on the East Coast Main Line. There were no passengers, but behind Mallard was a carriage known as a dynamometer car, containing the technical equipment to record the speed.
My great-grandfather, Joe, just knew when he opened her up that she was going to be able to do it. A record was going to be broken.
You just jumped to it like a license. Then, 108, 109, 110. Go on, old girl, I thought, we can do better than this. So I nursed her and shot through a little bathroom at 123. And then for a quarter of a mile, while they tell me the folks in the car held their breath. 126 miles per hour.
126 miles per hour is a record for steam locomotives that still stands today. At Peterborough Station, Tommy and Joe posed for photos. The fastest men on the planet under steam.
It wasn't something that he did for limelight. It wasn't something that he lived off the back of. Driving an engine and driving Mallard was his job.
The Second World War broke out the following year. The railway network turned black and white.
Fripperies such as bright colours, you forget all that. It becomes utilitarian. But also, it's done from that security point of view of a brightly coloured engine stands out to an aircraft.
Even the exceptional had to lose their sparkle. And indulgences like speed records were forgotten. Everything was directed to the war effort.
Compartments like this one were transformed. Fold-down armrests were removed to make more room for passengers, blue light bulbs were installed, and the windows were blacked out, leaving just a tiny gap to see through. And this caused real problems because the names of the stations were also removed so that German bombers couldn't use them to discover their location.
Troop trains once more headed for South Coast ports.
They're crossing the Channel in some great adventure. We're on our way to Berlin. They feel as if the train might take them straight to the heart of the Third Reich, where they can maybe have it out with Adolf Hitler and then be back in time for Christmas. This sense of adventure kind of replicates maybe what some of their fathers might have felt in 1914, but just like their fathers as well, they will quickly be confronted with the harsh and cruel reality of what warfare is all about.
That reality meant retreat, humiliation, and evacuation from Dunkirk. British troops wouldn't return to French soil for 4 years. When they did, railways would once again play a key but little-known role. The 6th of June 1944. D-Day, the liberation of Europe. The lead up to the invasion was the largest mass movement in the history of warfare. The British rail network played a key role.
The railways had moved 2.5 million troops and 1.5 million tons of stores to the south coast. It was an extraordinary logistical feat.
The Allies knew how important the French railway network was for the Nazis. Something had to be done.
In the run-up to D-Day, fighters and bombers had destroyed much of the French railway network. In combination with local resistance fighters, to ensure that the Germans could not use the railways to bring up reinforcements to the beaches where the Allied troops were landing.
The tactic proved a success. The Allies established a foothold on the Normandy beaches. Next to shore was an unsung railway army. British and American military engineers, together with civilian workers on a mission to repair the wrecked French network. Southern railway ferries were adapted so locomotives could be unloaded directly onto the quayside in France. Their job was to supply the advancing Allied armies.
In the 3 months after D-Day, some 1,300 engines, some 20,000 freight wagons cross the English Channel into Normandy, and as the tracks are relayed by the efforts of engineering and railway troops, these trains will be the absolutely critical supply side for the advancing Allied armies. Were it not for the engineering troops, were it not for that effort, that whole gargantuan push, it's possible that the war might not have ended in 1945. It might have gone on into 1946.
In the final months of the Second World War, history was repeating itself.
There is a rather great irony that some 120 years after the Stockton and Darlington Railway opened and that British technology was then used to build the first lines in France and Belgium, British engineers were then carrying over rail equipment and rebuilding the lines of the French railway, which they had initiated some 120 years before.
Victory came at a cost. Heavy wartime use left the railways shabby and worn out. And once again, the world was changing. Cars were now affordable. Railway passenger numbers dropped. The Big Four were almost bankrupt.
The idea of them returning to even the relatively modest profits which they'd been generating during the 1930s was unrealistic.
The Labour government decided to take control. At midnight on the 31st of December 1947, the railways came under public ownership. British Railways was born. Trains were repainted, and a new logo, nicknamed the Lion on a Unicycle, was introduced. In the following years, more modern technology arrived. The age of steam was over.
New trains came along in the 50s and 60s, diesels, electrics. People didn't dislike them. They were faster, they were cleaner. But at the same time, the steam locomotive has such a power. The general public recognized that there was something being lost there. There was a yearning or a fondness for what was disappearing.
200 years on, steam trains continue to have a special hold on the public's imagination. At the National Railway Museum, Matthew Delaney has been given access to the footplate of the Mallard, where his record-breaking great-grandfather Joe Duddington once stood.
Well, if you just have a minute.
Yeah, of course.
This is really... This is special. I feel the presence of everybody. My great-grandfather, his energy's still in here, and my grandparents, they're all here. She's part of our family. It's not a strong and it's not just a machine. This is where it all happened. This is where the noise, the smell, the heat. You wouldn't be able to touch any of these things. You'd feel the motion, the vibration of her rumbling down the tracks, her coming to life. The muscles, the power.
The empire is no more, and Britain is no longer a significant railway power. But the world-changing influence of the first passenger service 200 years ago is undisputed. First, railways changed the world. Then the world forced the railways to change. Might that versatility be the key to their future success?
I think there'll always be an anxiety that the railway industry is going to become redundant or defunct. But it continues to find new and interesting ways to improve its speed and its style and its relevance. It's going to be really interesting to see how it continues to do this and the influences it has on the future.
To think about how the railway started, initially in collieries, to think how that spread everywhere. It's just the most efficient form of transport, whether it be freight, whether it be going from A to B, and just covering all sorts of landscapes, mountainous, across plain, flat land. It's just something that's found its way everywhere. I feel proud that it's come from Britain. It's not often that, as a country, we all have something that we can unify together and be proud of. It feels great.
Rolling along a luxury line with Bulgarian royalty in the driving seat, the Orient Express, a golden era of travel. Stream or watch Wednesday at 9 on More 4. Next tonight, John David Washington stars in an immersive network premiere. An AI super weapon could dictate the future in expansive epic, The Creator.